Hello. Welcome to the Parenting Connection show. Nope, not yet. Okay, not yet. I gotta wait for the radio station to tell me what to do.
The audio and all other media materials aired on this broadcast station does not necessarily reflect the opinion of the management of Rhema Word Broadcasting, Rhema Gospel Radio Incorporated, KOER LPFM, its affiliates, and or the staff and volunteers of these entities. Please direct all correspondence to the appropriate company's website and or business address. Welcome to the Parenting Connections radio broadcast with Dr. Tyra Hodge. Dr. Hodge is an author, speaker, the founder and president of Parenting Connections, whose mission is to strengthen families. She has been an educator for over 15 years, and Parenting Connections is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Now, let's join Dr. Tyra Hodge for today's radio broadcast.
Hello, Cypress, Texas. Oh my goodness. It has been a while. 9 months, I think, to be exact, that I have gone off the radio. Well, I got busy with life. There was COVID, there was kids, there was all kinds of activities that came up, but I am so glad to be back. I'm so excited. I have a wonderful show for coming back on. I have Mike Ashcraft with me today, and Mike wrote a book called To Be Concluded. Also, the subtitle was How to Prevent Your Past from Piling Up and finding hope for your future. And so Mike is from, he has a church out in Port City, North Carolina. And so he enjoys the beach with his family, 2 daughters and a son-in-law. He didn't say whether he had any dogs and cats. And so we'll find out later whether Mike is a dog person or whether he is a cat person. Mike, welcome to our show.
Oh, hey, Dr. Tyra. It's so good to be with you. What a wonderful greeting.
I am so glad you're here. And so in a time where, lots of things have happened, we're coming out of a shutdown. So people got to see people be people. But not just that, I think we all deal with things potentially in life. Well, the Bible says we do. I mean, we deal with stuff, but sometimes our stuff is ourselves. Yeah. And so, Mike, first of all, tell us a little bit about, what you're doing out there. I know you're a pastor of a church, and you've been a pastor for since 1999. Is that correct?
That's correct. We started the church in 1999, so I've been the pastor there for 22 years. And you kind of asked if I was a dog person or a cat person. I have 2 daughters, and so I was trying to be a human person. And so we did okay with that. So we have no animals, no pets. It's not that I'm opposed to them. We just don't have any. And I have 2 daughters and a son-in-law. They've been married for almost 5 years, and we will be expecting our first grandbaby in June of this year. So we're really excited about that.
And they're like puppies, and so
you can give them back and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and they really are blessings. Hey, tell us a little bit about what's going on with your book. I mean, I love To Be Concluded. Tell us about that.
So the book is written. It's based out of some things that we've been doing as a church. When probably about 2004, 2005, I started picking a word for my year. It was I picked one word to frame the way in which I would see God's work through my life for the entire year. Instead of making New Year's resolutions, we picked words. So I let our church to do that. And so it kind of took off and people were doing it and picking words. And what would happen is toward the end of the year, everybody would start getting excited about picking their new words. It was basically like the old word that they had for the year just kind of fizzled out and they just jumped onto the new one. So we began to create a personal retreat at the end of the year with the specific purpose of helping people conclude their year with their word, to both see and understand maybe what God taught them, what they're able to see through that lens, and also as a preparation to start the new year so they didn't just run from one thing to the next. We did that for a few years, and I realized that that's how a lot of people actually end up living their lives. They just go from one thing to the next. And the way I start the book is with a story about a Netflix binge. It was my first Netflix binge. And if you've seen Netflix, if you watch an episode of a show, at the very bottom corner when your first show is done or when the episode's done, it says your show will continue in, then it counts down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And before you know it, you've watched like 2 seasons of the binge watch. And I think that's how a lot of our lives go. We just run from event to event to event. 1 week bleeds into the next, 1 month bleeds into the next, 1 year bleeds into the next. And there's no markers that sort of say when one thing stops and another thing starts. And it's not just a matter of the pace of our lives. It actually undermines the purpose that God has for our lives. And so that's what kind of sparked the idea for the book. And that's where it came from.
Wow. I think about David, how he rehearsed his victories, the Bible says, and that, he remembered killing the bear and I think the lion, and that he knew that he had what it takes, that he had God on his side to be able to slay Goliath. Your ministry also deals with a lot of young adults. In my personal, work ministry, and I believe that education has been my mission field. I deal with a lot of young people, and I'm often talking to them about their destinies. If I ever have that little short moment, I let them know that there is a purpose and a plan for their life. And so you talk about destination thinking. What is destination thinking?
Well, first of all, Dr. Tyra, I want to just tell you how, what you do in education is heroes work and is front lines ministry for actually developing, future generations. So thank you for that. And to all of you who are listening who serve in that way. Destination thinking is one of those really interesting ideas where people assume that when they get somewhere other than where they are, then they'll finally be ready to do whatever it is they're supposed to do. Like when they get out of high school, then they'll be happy, or they'll have done what they'll be ready for the next thing. When they get out of college, when they get married, when they get a house, when they get kids, when they, when something happens, then they'll finally be able to be content or be happy or find their purpose. And as though a purpose is some kind of destination that we finally reach or attain, but rather it's really something that we all know that's not true. We've all tried to, when we finally get the thing that we wanted, and it didn't fully satisfy us, we start chasing the next thing. So we all know it doesn't work. And I think what we have to learn is that God's purposes run so much more subversive and subtle than just the accomplishments that we're able to sort of latch onto or grab onto in our lives. But it also, I think, speaks to the fact that we need these sort of lines, these finish lines or starting lines to help define seasons. But if they just become sort of these points that we just run through, we don't ever actually stop and understand what one season meant for the specific purpose of another season beginning. One of the main verses in there that we used is, you mentioned David. David's son Solomon wrote these words in Ecclesiastes. He says that better is the end of a thing than its beginning. And it's Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 8. And when you think about it, if something has been really bad or you've been through a hard season, well, it's easy to assume that, of course, better is the end of a thing than its beginning because it's over, it's done. But I don't think that's exactly why the end of a thing is better than its beginning. I think the reason an end of a thing is better is because that thing, whether it was really hard or whether it was really good, it actually matters. And it matters in who we are becoming and how God is sort of using us in the world that he is creating through what we are doing. That's what the exploration of the book sort of became as it unfolded. And when I began writing the book, I thought it was going to end with a very practical, tactical way to hey, do a personal retreat, draw finish lines. But it really became about pursuing God's vision for the redemption of all things, especially in a world where so many things are broken.
So you mentioned becoming, and so when I hear that word becoming, it kind of means to me like we're ever evolving. But what are we what are we in what are we evolving into?
That's a great question. I think the American dream sort of has us evolving into some successful person that has a house, a car, or whatever version of that we end up sort of adopting or just by default. In fact, one of the things that we talk about even as a church is that everybody believes something. And particularly think about education specifically, or parenting, or anything that everybody has a belief system about these things that we say we want to get a good education so we can get a good job, and we want to get a good job so we can have a good life. And all of those underneath that, there's a underlying belief system that never gets pushed on or pressed on. So the idea is that a good education to get a good job means a good job is defined by making a certain amount of money that will afford a certain kind of lifestyle. And so education then is defined as a means to an end by which we have economic success, when really an education is about developing our hearts and our minds and understanding of the world around us. And so lots of things get defined. It's our view of money, our view of education, our view of church, our view of most everything. And what's interesting about the gospel and the way the gospel was taught by Jesus was that he came to establish his rule and his reign, which I believe was actually what he intended for us in the beginning. That in the beginning in the garden, God created us to rule and to reign, to participate, to create, and to contribute with him as his agents to steward the beauty of all that God had created. And of course, sin, destroyed that and then created the separation and division and all the things that we see today. And so what God is doing in the gospel, what he's doing through Jesus, is he is rebuilding us and remaking us and reshaping us into this new humanity that lives under his rule and his reign, where our marker, the marker of his image, is God's love for us, then extended into the world around us, where we learn to live rightly related with everything else. The word I talk about in the book is the old ancient Hebrew word shalom, which most of the time translates as peace. And obviously it's a good translation, but it's insufficient for the way we think about it today. That shalom is actually a relational word. It's where everything is rightly related to everything else, that I am rightly related to God, that we are rightly related to one another, that we are rightly related to our work, we are rightly related to creation, that all these things are redeemed and restored into the way that God intended them to be. And so the image that he is shaping us or forming us into is fundamentally defined by this idea of God's love for us, his agape love for us. And that means that we live as his image bearers under his authority in every sphere or realm of our lives. And then out of that, we are entrusted to steward our minds, our eyes, our ears, our hearts, our souls, our families, the relationships. We're intended to steward those things under the authority that God has granted to us. And that is a lifelong pursuit, and it is most often experienced in the most intimate and intricate of moments, not in these big, giant ideas. A lot of kids that I talk to come out of college or high school, and they think, I got to do big things for God. We've got this idea that we have to do big things for God. And, I tell our church this all the time. I said, you realize that God does big things all by himself. He created everything that we see without us. He doesn't need us to do anything big. Right. And so, but what happens is we get this pressure that we have to change the world, and we don't, and we lose sight of what God has actually asked of us, which is to be faithful in the moment that's in front of us. And that's actually, one of the stories I write about in the book is my own. I pastor a church in Wilmington, North Carolina, which is a little small beach town tucked in on the southeast corner of North Carolina, so a far cry from Texas. And the church had grown; it had gotten pretty big, and we had a lot of things going on. And I remember I was driving into the campus one day. We have a 32-acre campus, so it's pretty large. I drove around, and I pulled into the parking place back behind where my office is, and I sat there. And for the first time, I think the church is probably 10 years old. for the first time in 10 years, the weight of everything just kind of hit me. And I thought, oh my gosh, what have I done? And I said it kind of like a declaration, like, oh my gosh, what have I got myself into? But it was paralyzing. And what I meant was, I have no idea what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm in over my head. I've bitten off more than I can chew. You know, God, you've picked the wrong person. All the things that we feel like we're inadequate for something that God has asked us to do. What I had to do is to take that declaration of what have I done? What have I got myself into, and turn it into a question and say, Lord, what is it that I have done? Like, just really get curious and say, Lord, can you begin to show me some next steps? And what I learned from that, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt
No,
you, but
it's fine.
you said something that just kind of rang true, and then, my whole life flashed before my eyes. But with all the saints of old, you look at Moses, Abraham, you look at Joshua, Gideon, people that thought they were inadequate. They thought, what they were doing didn't matter. Never thought that they would be chosen by the one true God. And so, I mean, I love what you were saying there, and I just had to interject that, because we think the things that we do from day to day. I mean, I get frustrated and I feel like I'm not making a difference. And I just have to believe that I've at least planted some seeds, and sometimes you do see those sprout, sometimes you don't, or at least we don't, not right now. And so that, these big things that we think that we have to do, sometimes it's just loving that child, or loving that person in the church, or just loving our neighbor. So I know that in your book, you draw out some of the beauty of redemption. How did that take effect in your own life?
Yeah, that's a great question. What most of us have this idea, especially living and you mentioned it, it's a lot of times, being in a school or teaching or working with kids, sometimes it just feels futile, right? It feels like, and you can pick any issue that we face, even in our culture. There are people who've been working on these issues or working in these issues for decades and sometimes generations, and you feel like, oh my gosh, is this making any difference? And we often tend to think about the way God, his work in this world would be that he sort of solves problems. And so part of what I write about in the book is the Rubik's Cube. But the Rubik's Cube was one of my favorite toys when I was growing up, and it could be solved. And I even bought a book called 45 Seconds. I think it's solved Rubik's Cube in under a minute, which I'm thinking, this is perfect, because I can not only solve it, I can solve it fast. And if anything speaks to our way of doing things, it's solving things fast. But what the economy of God, what his purpose is, because solving problems would mean alleviating suffering. It would be eliminating the brokenness that our world is. But the reality is our world is fundamentally broken, and it's not going to be less broken until like the culmination of all things. That's what the Bible teaches us, and how or what that looks like, we don't know fully, but we know that day is coming. And but his point, or to me, the point in this is that God isn't looking to solve the world's problems. He's looking to redeem God's people. And the way I found this person was in a lot of different ways. And I don't want to belittle things, right? Because the suffering that people endure is devastating. And there are a lot of people who their lives have just been wrecked by the circumstances, the suffering they face. But even like with COVID, right? COVID was one of those situations where it was horrific. When things shut down in March of 2020, we suspended all of our gatherings in the church. But I remember we were actually preaching through a series called Hope in the Dark. We'd already planned that series when March hit, and we were talking about hope in the dark. And the text was Romans 8, which is God saying, I have subjected creation in futility. It was subjected by me in futility, so that in its bondage, right, in this state, it would actually find this hope for liberation, for freedom. And what you begin to notice is this language of redemption, which isn't the alleviation of suffering or hardship. It is the promise that God uses them. And what I remember telling our church, and this was kind of the message, was that, when things got really hard and it sort of got compressed, people are saying, we can't wait to get back to normal. And I remember thinking, like, that is not what God wants us to do. God is not trying, this is not a season for us to just hope it ends so we can go back to the way things were. This is an opportunity. If we trust this, if we listen to his voice, if we pursue what he is doing and let him do his work in this moment, then perhaps we will come out of this with a renewed hope for the future that is going to look very different than what going back to normal would have looked like. And so out of that, what you begin to understand is that redemption isn't trying to somehow get over the hard things that we've been through, but it's rather to understand, God, how can you use these things? And, I have things in my life where we've gone through really difficult seasons, whether it was some loss that my wife and I experienced, whether it was, struggles that we had in the early days of the church, some things that happened even in an old ministry context that I thought I wanted to quit, I wanted to run. But it was out of those really difficult things, sometimes the ashes of those things, that the beauty began to emerge. And, people like this, right? The stories that we tend to tell are the ones of the person who, when everything looked like it was about to end, something happened. And out of that came this beautiful redemptive story, which is what the gospel is. When Jesus took the cross and he gave it was like the darkest day that kind of got this judo move where it becomes the most beautiful thing. I just learned a new word this past week, and I taught it to our church on Sunday. The word is eucatastrophe, EUCA, eucatastrophe. It's catastrophe with the EU on the front. And what it means the sudden favorable outcome. And so what happens is on the cross is exactly that. It's like we're thinking that Jesus is coming as the king. And this is what Easter is about, right? He's coming to be the king, and kings don't die on crosses. Kings, destroy and they take over and conquer the armies that are oppressing people, and they take over and establish their own rule. And this king comes and he dies, which looks like a catastrophe. But what God was doing is he was like, no, this is going to be this is unraveling. When it finally unravels enough, we realize that at the end of that unraveling is the thing we were looking for all along. And that's what a eucatastrophe is, right? It's a sudden favorable outcome that we didn't see coming. And that's what redemption really is. The story I use in the book is from The Lion King, which most everybody is familiar with, one of my favorite Disney movies of all time. And what we fail to recognize, right? It's Simba, it's Hakuna Matata. Simba comes back. But what happened in that movie that makes the movie so moving and so powerful is what happens in the middle, which is where Mufasa dies. He's trampled by the wildebeest, and Simba is left there, and then Scar makes him feel like it was his fault. And Mufasa doesn't come back as the hero of the story, but it is out of that hardship and that suffering that the story actually emerges into something that we've all come to love. And that is what redemption looks like in a broken world. It's that God takes these pieces and he uses them for his glory and for his image to be seen in the humanity that he has created and called to himself.
Wow. So we got a strong theme of redemption. And so in the world today, everything still seems a little difficult. What advice would you give someone struggling with hope? Because, because of redemption, we have hope. And so, through everything we've gone through, everything, we see happening in the world, for Christians, we hang on to the hope that, one day that our Lord and Savior is going to come and take us out of here and we'll live in his kingdom. But what about, those that seem to be without hope?
Yeah, that's a common emotion. I mean, people are tired. They're frustrated. Things look like they're going to be solved or better, and then it goes right back to sort of the status quo, the way things have always been. We put our hope in a lot of things. We put our hope in politicians. We put our hope in even pastors, and and it's unfortunate what we see oftentimes in our world. One of my favorite proverbs is Proverbs 13:12. It says, "Hope deferred makes a heart sick, but a desire fulfilled is a tree of life."
Yeah.
And I think about this, when Jeremiah, and this is part of one of the things, again, when I was writing this book, it kind of turned into something that I wasn't expecting it to become. But Jeremiah is famous for his book called Lamentations, which is a book in the Bible that is basically what gave Jeremiah his name, the weeping prophet, right? He was lamenting all that he saw and looked around in the sadness that he felt. And in there, what he says is, and he acknowledges, my heart is downcast. Like I'm feeling empty. I'm feeling without hope. And then he says this, yet I call this to mind. I call this to mind that, Lord, your mercies are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I recall this to mind, and therefore I have hope. Your mercies are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. And so what this teaches, this is not sort of a platitude to go, oh, just write a nice little phrase or tweet something nice and you'll feel better about yourself. It's sort of a grabbing on to a bedrock foundation that we desperately need. And what God promises us is that in each new moment, in each new morning, right? That's what the picture, this new sunrise, there is the promise of new mercy. And the way I talk about this in the book, and this is where I'll get to the, kind of the answer, it's kind of a long way to answer the question. But what people are looking for typically when they're looking for hope, they're looking for a circumstance to be different. And when that doesn't happen, we get very disappointed, and often we get angry and we start blaming God or whoever didn't do what they should have done to make this circumstance work out in our favor, or even, in favor of just general humanity, right? Well, this should have just gone better than it did. But I think what this does is it gives us a frame of reference to sort of make sure that our hope isn't in our circumstances, but rather it is the foundation that has been given in Christ Jesus. And what Paul writes about in that concluding part of Romans 8 is he says that the Lord works all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And we quote this verse a lot. But the way we apply this is just like what Jeremiah was saying, that I recall this to mind, that his mercies come to us with a sense of freshness with every new sunrise. And I think what we actually learn is it doesn't just come fresh with the new sunrise. It actually comes fresh in the new moment. And the metaphor that I use in the book for grace or for his mercy in this is oxygen. And none of us wake up in the morning and are gasping for air and hoping that we're going to have enough oxygen for the day. We just wake up. We hardly even think about it. We just breathe in and breathe out. We just trust that this oxygen that is sufficient for this breath will be there when we need it. And now if someone puts their hands around your neck and they choke that out, you're going to fight tooth and nail because you recognize that's actually the source of your life. And this is exactly what grace is. What happens to us when we feel hopeless is this is like the circumstances choking the life out of us. And what we don't realize is that source of life, the grace, is sufficient for us in the moment, and that it's sufficient for the moment. You can't store up grace for 10 minutes from now or 20 minutes from now or 2 hours from now. You have to trust that this is where faith and hope and these things kind of begin to run this course. That what you have to do is you have to trust that the grace that was sufficient in this moment will also be available in the next one. And when you begin to experience that, what you find is this different way of viewing and seeing the life in which we are living. We begin to walk by faith and not by sight, which is really what Paul writes about in the New Testament. And so that's what we're trying to get to in the book, is to help you realize that we cannot depend on our circumstances necessarily being better to be the foundation of our hope. That there's been another foundation of hope that can actually sustain the weight of human desire.
We put so much hope, and you mentioned school and things and people, the church, and we noticed that everything that could have been shaken the last couple of years was shaken. And my youngest son asked me one time, he's like, Mom, who do you love more in the whole world? I love the Lord. I said the right thing. He's like, but do you love the Lord more than me? I said, baby, if I loved you more than the Lord, the Lord would probably take you out, sweetheart. and so, but yes, we put all this energy and we put all this hope and really love, into all these things, into my job, into, ministry sometimes.
Yep.
And, hoping, I don't know, we're hoping for these, this big result, or this infilling and fulfillment, and yet it still leaves us wanting.
Yeah.
And we know there's only one thing that can fill that void that we have. There's only one thing that this thing, in our spirit can be satisfied by. So when you see somebody that is just at their wits, I mean, what do you have to say to them? Talk to people that are still struggling, because we don't know what they're
Yeah.
going through.
Yeah.
Some of the pain is caused because of stuff we done.
Yeah.
Sometimes the pain is caused by something done to us. But talk to each person at where they're at right now.
Yeah, I would say to the person who, if this is where grace becomes so important, forgiveness becomes so important. This is where the gospel actually matters. What people will tend to do, and this is why I think the finish lines, these conclusions are so important. If we are in a situation where we feel hopeless because of what we have done, our tendency is to simply promise not to do those things again, right? And we all know how that goes. It just never goes well. We start trying to count how many days it's been since we did that thing. We try to, kind of mask or kind of create this streak, if you will, of how long we've been, perfect, or we haven't done this thing, and then we feel better about ourselves, or whatever it is. The secret, or the solution, I guess, and what I think God is asking for us, is to trust Him, to trust that His forgiveness is sufficient, to trust that His forgiveness is pervasive, and then to trust that His source is sufficient. So, for example, one of the things that is that I write about in the book in Isaiah 43, Isaiah writes and he says, and he's talking about God doing a new thing, which everybody says, we want to do a new thing. And everybody wants to do a new thing until they realize how much doing a new thing is going to do to the old thing that we've held on to for so long. And so he's asking us to do a new thing. What Isaiah writes, he says, God says, forget the former things, for I am doing a new thing. And then he talks about it, praying and asking for this. And when he says forget, he's not talking about amnesia. He's not talking about forget it in the sense of amnesia, but he's talking about, I think, forget it like if you've ever tried to do something and you work and you work and you work and finally you're so frustrated that you can't do it with your own effort, you just go, forget it. And it's an act of surrender. And I think that's what God is actually, if you're here and you're at that place, what I invite you to do is to surrender, to say, okay, I've done all I can. I'm my only option now is to trust you, Lord, and to be faithful in this moment. And what you do in that is when you say, I'm going to trust you in this moment, what you are doing is you're availing His promise of redemption for the next one and the next one and the next one. And what we have to avoid doing is what we typically do, especially as kind of Western American human beings, is when something starts to work or to go in a direction, we start calculating how we're going to make it happen, or how it's going to, how we're going to make sure this continues on this trajectory, and how we can make this God's plan sort of come to fruition. And we start calculating the outcomes. And what you have to understand is that just because you can't understand how God is going to do something, it has no capacity on His ability to do it. He does stuff that we don't understand all the time. And so the solution, and what I would say to the person who is struggling right now, I would say what God is asking of you is not to promise not to do it again. What He is asking you to do is to trust Him in this moment. And then I would say to you, I want you to if you're driving, don't do this, obviously, but I want you to take you can close your eyes, or if you're driving, don't close your eyes, but just take a deep breath, breathe in and breathe out, and then consider, right, in this moment, that perhaps God brought you just a smidgen of peace and just a smidgen of hope, and you kind of felt that to be a reality in your own world in that moment. And you go, okay, yeah, I felt that. And then the next thought is, well, what's going to happen in 15 minutes from now? And that's not the point. The point is that if you found Him faithful and you found His peace available in this particular moment, what you have to learn how to trust is that it will be there in the next one and in the next one and the next one. We have to learn how to be faithful with what's right in front of us. That is the way in which God begins to redeem all of the pain and all the suffering and all the things that we have done to one another and sometimes to ourselves. And what I would add on to that, and this is where I have to be really careful, because the person who has been harmed by someone else, the same principle applies, right? It is about forgiveness. One of the miracles of the gospel is that we are called to forgive, not according to the offense or to the degree of the offense with which we have been wronged with or wronged by, but rather we are to forgive as Christ has forgiven us. And what this doesn't mean that it's all hunky-dory, and it doesn't mean that you're not taking this seriously. What it means is you're free to name your pain and to address it with God, and then to ask him to enter into that. That's exactly what I think Jeremiah was doing in his lament. He was like, Lord, my soul hurts. And I think he had really specific reasons why. And I think as a person who's been hurt, you don't need to try to minimize your suffering or your struggle or how disappointed you are. You need to bring it all to him, because that's what trust and that's what faith looks like. But it really comes back to the same thing. It's even in that, can you learn to be faithful to God in the moment that is right in front of you, and not try to over forecast how you're going to be faithful 2 days from now or 2 minutes from now or 2 years from now, but rather I'm going to trust in this moment. And once you begin to do that, I think it opens us up to see the future with a little bit more hope, which I think is where the gospel actually begins to lead us into that particular way of seeing the world around us.
So conclusions, you mentioned in your book that they're a gift that help you guide your present. Talk some about that, but I'm kind of trying to figure out what it kind of looks like when you're actually concluding something, and then you're working on this new beginning. I mean, is this something that you're doing every year? Is this something that you're doing, I mean, at a milestone, or what does it look like?
And the answer is yes, right? It is at milestones. It is at various places and as a someone who works in the school system, you understand this, right? At a graduation is a very natural conclusion. So at graduation, what they do is they stand up and they put the tassels on, the hats, the funny hats and the gowns, and they talk about where you've been. And they kind of consecrate this moment, and they celebrate like where you're going and you're going to change the world and all that. And so the answer is yes, we do need, we have personal retreats every year at our church. I do a summertime, we do a summertime kind of break as well. But what's more important, and the way it connects is what happens to us is we kind of get hyper obsessed about the future, either worrying about it or trying to control it, or some version of usually that narrative. And what I found is that we don't just need conclusions at milestones or at the end of a year or sort of the natural ones. And there are natural ones. Sometimes when you leave one job and go to another job, there are natural conclusions. But a lot of times, conclusions, our lives will just continue if we're not careful. So what I'm trying to encourage people to do is to find, not so much to manage the pace of your life, which is important, but to manage the rhythms of your life. And if you think about this, what makes a rhythm is rest. If you just have a constant noise, it just sounds like static. But if you break that static up with rest, you have a beat, right? You have something that we can kind of move to it, and we can kind of find our place within it. And this is exactly how God created things in the very beginning. He ordained, right, seasons. He puts these lights in the sky to ordain the seasons, the days and the nights, so that there's the end of one thing and the beginning of another. And so I do, personally, I try to, and what I said in the book is you just have to pick a point and draw a line. Sometimes you've been in the middle of something and you need to just pick a point and draw a line and go, today I'm going to sort of declare this finished. And we do this if you work in a job where there's always more to do than you can possibly get done. I know nobody can relate to that, right? I mean, it's like it's every day. And if you go home every day feeling like you haven't finished and you haven't kept up, it's eventually going to just crush you. And so what you do is you pick a point and you say, today, Lord, I've been faithful what you've asked me to do. You kind of look up and try to get some perspective on how God sees this and how God sees the world. And then you entrust that to him. And so I do this multiple times a year. I do this whenever I'm in a season where it just feels really, really kind of elongated, where it doesn't seem to end. I'll just pick a point, draw a line. Sometimes I'll use my day off as kind of a Sabbath to go, and I'm not going to try to solve the problem. I'm not going to try to work on the problem. I'm just going to enjoy being with God. Sometimes it's surfing. Sometimes it's walking on the beach. Sometimes it's breakfast with my wife, but it's not consumed with all those things. And what it does, it allows a little bit of space. And in that space, what you begin to do is to sort of create a rhythm, even for the hard seasons, because it's in those places that we begin to see, we get perspective, and we realign ourselves with not trying to figure out how to manage the future or how to control the future or worry about the future. But we realize that in that moment, what we're able to do is to simply be faithful to God. That's what's going to be pleasing to him. It's our faith that he's going to use for his purpose of redemption. And we just have to learn to believe that.
And we talk about these conclusions, you look up and if you don't take that rest, if you don't, sit back and reflect, you'll look up and you'll be 50, like, with me. But, and what I've learned is that even then, it's not done, we transition into a new area, you're transitioning into grandparenting. I did that transition, and then there was like a new role and new calling, set before me, as far as being a mentor to grandchildren and loving them and helping teach my daughter mother. And I have kids that are coming too. So tell me about what your life. Tell me how you use this, what you learned to write this book. Tell me how you used it in your life. Give us some examples.
Yeah, and that's a great question. The reason it's so important to conclude things. So it's a point in time, but you're also bringing something to a close so that you don't always try to relive what you've always done. It's because what happened, it's like when your kids are young, they're 4, you want to freeze them so they don't ever change. And then when you kind of always long for them to be the way that they were, you sort of miss what's happening in front of you. And that's kind of obvious with kids, but it's true in everything. I've watched it, been in a part of a church that has gone from literally a living room to a pretty large organization with a lot of staff, and now a lot of staff who are young and they're cool and they have great ideas. And I'm not like that person anymore, right? I'm a different person. And so if I'm always trying to compete with them or to make sure that I have to prove myself to them, and which is exactly what a failure to conclude that season will do to me. It'll leave me with a sense of insecurity and trying then to prove that I still have what it takes. And what I do is I rob all the community. I mean, like literally the relationships that we are building together. I rob all of that because I'm still trying to be something that I was. And the reality is I'm a different person, and that's actually good. I am a little older. I am a little more mature, which means I've lost some of the coolness. I've lost some of the, sort of some of the things but what I'm learning to do now is, okay, Lord, what are you doing in my life? What is my call? How do I continue to move into this new season of my life? And what I found is some of the most profound richness in my own life. One of the things I wrote in the book, I was going to try to find this here, but it was essentially, I called it an unraveling of the gospel. And I'll just read it. What I said is that my own unraveling of the gospel has led me to see things that I never considered before. And this is one of the great things that you experience when you aren't trying to repeat what you learned long ago, but you instead continue to walk in the unfolding of God's mercy. You continue to learn, and you grow and become. It is frightening for sure, but it is oh so freeing. And when we're moving into the future, we are recognizing that the future is yet to be written, and there is, by definition, uncertainty ahead in new things. And it calls us to learn and to grow. And the older we get and the more experience we have and the more sure we are of our experience, the more we tend to control and depend on what we have already learned, which interestingly enough, right, a lot of people's favorite verses is Proverbs 3. Trust the Lord with all of your heart And what does it say next? And do not lean on your own understanding. And a lot of us, we get so good at what we already know and we stop learning and we just start applying what we have already done. And what we're doing is we're missing all the new things that God is doing in and through our lives. And, part of my own challenge, is I try to read widely. I read and try to learn from different voices, and it's not wishy-washy. Like it's not trying to see which way the wind blows, but it is trying to learn to understand the perspectives and people's voices and what they are bringing and contributing to what God is doing in the world around us, and how I become a part of that in sort of a unifying way, and not continually trying to build my little kingdom.
I like that you said that, because sometimes we get used to and like you said, not just flowing with the wind or whatever, but we do have to listen to what other thoughts are. Just recently, matter of fact, just in the last couple of weeks, I've been trying to read Spurgeon, and his autobiography is like very difficult to read. And I have a doctorate in education, but it's higher level. But I'm also reading his stuff on prayer, and oh my gosh, it just really opened my eyes to so much. And then it opened my eyes to really God the Holy Spirit, which I'm glad that I can still grow, because if we're not growing, then we're just kind of stuck and then we start stinking. And so, so I'm starting to understand a little bit more about this to be concluded that you're talking about.
Yeah,
So,
I think we'd be sorry. I said I think we'd be surprised at how many people stop growing,
mhm,
like really stop growing. And when that happens, it just opens up, or it actually shuts down everything that is in front of us. And that's really why I think the idea of bringing, to a conclusion is not to tie it in a tight little bow. One of the big ideas in the book is that finished things become usable things. When we bring the things that we've been through to a sense of closure, to a conclusion, they become usable for what is about to happen in the future. Like God promises to work all things together for good. And that is an always ever sort of evolving way of life for us. It doesn't stop until we take our last breath.
wow, that's amazing. And he does. He tends to do things differently all the time. And if we're not careful, we'll miss it because we want to be stuck. I remember a church I went to a long time ago. They had a church split, in the 80s, and the church just never recovered, but they were still trying to do things the way they did way back then, and the church wouldn't grow. And so I saw God's hand trying to do something, but the pillars of the church refused to let God move. And so I always get, sometimes I get to travel and speak, and very blessed to do that. But I always feel bad, and I know that the Holy Spirit is grieved when you can see him trying to move, and we the humans stop it. So and I'm not talking about this is back way back when I was little, young speaking or something. But anyway, the moral of the story is that God wants to do so much, and he wants to speak to us, and he wants to move us on to that next level. We have about 2 minutes left. Mike, I really want you to give us some final words. Give us some final words, some final encouragement, and just really lead us out of here.
Wow, okay. So here's what I would say is that one of the things, and this is the anchor for our hope, is that what Jesus came to do, like when he died on the cross, we're celebrating this at Easter, right? Died on the cross, and he rose again. He brought resurrection. He came to give us life, and he came to establish his kingdom. He said his kingdom is at hand, and he invited us to trust him and to walk with him by faith. What I've come to believe, and what motivates me as deeply as anything in my life in the last 30 years, is this: that what I've come to believe is that every act of faith every time I trust him and bring his love to the world, every time I guard my heart, my eyes, my mind, every time I do those things, I'm cultivating something that is useful for the world that he longs to create. And when I extend and express that to another human being, I'm participating in the world that God longs to create. It's the work of restoration. That the things that we return to him, he restores them. And so I imagine what happens when I return a moment to him and he begins to act restoratively in the relationships. When I return a season to him, he begins to act, restoratively. When I return a habit to him and he begins to act restoratively, what the world might look like if we were to really get a vision for that kind of faith and faithfulness that happens every single moment of every single day.
Mike, thank you so much. Mike Ashcraft, y'all. And everything about him, links to the books and everything is in the description. Thank you so much for being my first show back on air. This was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
We are going to get the book and we're going to keep learning and we're going to keep growing and we're going to learn when we need to conclude things. Thank you for being with us today on Parenting Connections. I'll see you next Monday at 5 o'clock right here. If you have any questions, reach out to Mike, put it in the chat. Please share this out and like all the pages from wherever you're seeing this, YouTube, Facebook, everything. See you next week.
Thank you for tuning in to the Parenting Connections radio broadcast with Dr. Tyra Hodge. We hope something was said to enlighten and strengthen you and your family. If you have questions, you may reach Parenting Connections via email at info@parentingconnections.net. Join Dr. Tyra Hodge next week for another powerful broadcast.